gentlemen, and on behalf of the Dean and Chapter, welcome to Liverpool Cathedral. My name's Canon Mike Kirby, the organiser of these lectures, and it's a delight to welcome you for this first in-person lecture for this May 2023. For those of you who this may be your first time, the lecture series, Gilbert Scott Lectures, is actually entitled in honour not of the famous Giles Gilbert Scott, but actually his brother Dr. Sebastian Gilbert Scott, who was a nationally and internationally renowned physician and radiologist in London. I started this series in 2019, which marked the 140th anniversary of his birth in Hampstead in 1879. His obituaries in the medical journals highlighted his many clinical accomplishments, but also said how good a teacher he was, teaching his students by example through a kindly, cheerful, and optimistic manner. Our series is therefore designed so that we have a wide range of speakers who share their thoughts and their experiences in much the same way. For more information, do take a look at our webpage, dedicated webpage. The links are on the leaflets on your seats. As you know, these lectures are always completely free, which reflects the welcome and the encounter here at Liverpool. There are always costs to cover. That wasn't meant to be a hint. Beautifully timed. If you can offer a donation in the baskets at the back before you leave, that will be much appreciated. But there's no compulsion to do so. And finally, also on your seats, there should be some small evaluation sheets. If you can write a few thoughts on that before you leave about the lecture or the series or anything else, then that will be fine. And so, without further delay, it gives me great pleasure to introduce Zia Chaudhry. Barrister, author and speaker, Zia is well known to us here in the Cathedral and indeed throughout Merseyside and beyond. He's often heard on BBC Radio Merseyside and is presently the director of Premier Advocacy. We got just a taster of Zia's great interest in Islam and science from the short podcast that we recorded recently. And in that, he offered some great tidbits and tasters about what he's going to share with us tonight. So it's a delight to welcome Zia to start off our in-person lectures this year with a talk on Islam and science. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Zia Chaudhry.
Thank you, Canon Mike. Good evening, everybody. I'll start by making the obvious observation. This, of course, is a magnificent building, a beautiful chapel, and for those reasons alone, this place should not be tainted by a PowerPoint presentation. So, for those of you attending in the expectation of some colourful slides, I offer my apologies. For those of you here for an intense lecture about complex scientific theories, hoping to tax your brain cells, I need to make full disclosure. Despite me being here to deliver a lecture on Islam and science, one of my many claims to fame is that I'm the only person I can think of who managed to get 10 O-levels without a single science subject. So now that I've set the scene and taken some steps to manage expectations, let's begin. Initially, I toyed with calling this lecture, "What Have the Muslims Ever Done for Us?" A reference to that memorable Monty Python scene. And it was going to end with me saying something along the lines of, okay, so apart from coffee, algebra, hospitals, modern optics, surgery, universities, the crankshaft, soap, forceps, windmills, inoculation, and the flying machine, what have the Muslims ever done for us? Now, although that would have been a bit of fun, it was never my intention to simply recite a long list of Muslim scientific achievements. They do exist, and feel free to look into them yourselves. But for our purposes, what I'm more interested in is perhaps drawing out some themes that sit under the banner of Islam and science. Themes which might make us think about the historical development of science within both the philosophical as well as the physical world of Islam. Now, part of that development does include the individual Muslim contributions listed above. But what is perhaps more important is understanding what it was that led to those contributions and the role, if any, of the faith itself in nourishing the ground on which such a scientific culture was able to blossom. Having said that, it would be remiss of me to ignore the current scientific plight of many Muslim countries. So I intend to touch upon that theme towards the end of the lecture. When considering Islamic scientific achievements, it's important to begin by acknowledging that we're not talking about a few isolated inventions, relying on the established work of those who came before, but rather a body of original thinking that paved the way for future developments, including the European Renaissance itself. Jonathan Lyon considered these achievements in his book, The House of Wisdom, and concluded that this new science was breathtaking in its scope and offered a coherent explanation of just about everything. This new science spanned numerous subjects and sought to effect improvements in each one of them. So, for example, in the field of mathematics, we're not just concerned with the Arabic numerals derived from the pre-existing work that took place in India, but with the specifically Islamic stage in the development of this work. Although the Arabs were keen to acknowledge their debt to India, Lyons makes two important observations about the role of the Muslims, which serve to dispel the myth that all they did was copy the work of others. Firstly, by way of specific example, he remarks that although by the 9th century all 6 trigonometry functions were known, sine, cosine, tangent, cotangent, secant, cosecant, only the first was an import. The remaining 5 were Arab discoveries. Secondly, making a more general point, it's worth quoting him at some length. He remarks that traditionally, Hindu scientific works were written in verse for ease of memorization and offered little in the way of explanation, procedures, or proofs. As a result, the early Arab scholars and translators were faced with 2 immediate challenges: to disentangle the scientific content from the verse, and then to discover for themselves the complex procedures implied in the text. and he concludes that the absence of commentaries forced the Arabs to grapple with the fundamental science of the literature rather than rely on simple imitation. In other words, they had to apply their minds to the task at hand. They were aided by the introduction of paper and a growing thirst for knowledge, which generated a demand for more and better translations of Greek and other works. It was not, as some have suggested, the translations that gave rise to Arab science, but the other way round. And this became an era which was responsible for a multitude of polymaths, one of whom was Muhammad ibn Musa al-Khwarizmi, a 9th century Persian mathematician and astronomer who took his place in the famed House of Wisdom in Baghdad. Al-Khwarizmi's works were instrumental in introducing Arabic numerals to Europe. And it is in fact from one of his works that we get the word algebra, the book being called Al-Kitab al-Mukhtasar fi Hisab al-Jabr wal-Muqabala. But it was more than just the word algebra. Not a day goes by now in the 3rd decade of the 21st century without us hearing of algorithms. They impact upon every aspect of our lives. Every transaction, every inquiry in this digital age is governed by them. But few of us know that the word algorithm comes from the name Al-Khwarizmi, the man who presented the first systematic solution of linear and quadratic equations. And that particular fact reveals another indicator of the success of this Arab scientific culture, namely its contribution to language. Algebra, algorithm, alchemy, even alcohol, all came from the scientific language of the day, which was Arabic. But Al-Khwarizmi was not alone. Al-Battani was another 9th century mathematician whose achievements in developing trigonometry would not have endeared him to today's GCSE students, but they put him on the world map nevertheless. Another Muslim mathematical genius became famous in the West for something quite different. The Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam became an esteemed work of literature when translated by Edward Fitzgerald. But the success of this poem rather overshadowed, at least in the West, the fact that in the year 1079, Omar Khayyam calculated the length of the solar year to be 365.242,198,58156 days. He actually calculated it to 11 decimal points. And he was just out by fractions of a second to the 365.242,190, which was calculated recently with the aid of the Hubble telescope. He did that in the 11th century. In the 10th century, Ibn al-Haytham laid the foundations for the optical theories later used by Galileo and Copernicus, and was the first scientist to argue that vision is a phenomenon that takes place in the brain rather than the eyes. The 10th century also saw the birth of arguably the greatest of Islamic scientists, Avicenna, whom you may have heard of. Perhaps you might not have recognized him if I'd called him by his actual name, Abu Ali al-Hussein ibn Abdullah ibn Sina. His 14-volume Canon of Medicine became the standard medical text in Europe for over 5 centuries and was used in French universities as late as the 17th century. I want to close this particular section about Muslim scientific contributions with a few words about Ibn Nafis, a 13th century scholar of medicine who provided the first description of pulmonary circulation. Hold on, I hear you say, but wasn't it William Harvey who did that in 1628? Bear with me. Ibn Nafis's work was discovered in the Prussian State Library in 1924. And not surprisingly, it was thought that Harvey and other European scholars, like Michael Servetus and Andreas Vesalius, who had an interest in this area, would have been unaware of Nafis's work. Well, here's where the story gets interesting. Ibn Nafis was born in Damascus in 1213. An Italian physician named Andrea Alpego spent some time in Syria in the 16th century, where he encountered the work of Ibn Nafis and translated it into Latin. In 1547, after Alpego had died, that work was published in Venice. Michael Servetus spent time in Italy and in 1555 put forward a theory of pulmonary circulation. A similar view was put forward the same year by Andreas Vesalius, who had also spent time in Venice. Another discoverer of pulmonary circulation was Realdo Colombo, who happened to be a colleague of Vesalius. Now, not surprisingly, there were mutual accusations of plagiarism between the three Italian scholars, and it may well have been the case that the later work of the Englishman William Harvey was compiled oblivious to what had been going on in Italy. Except that we find that Harvey himself had studied at the University of Padua between 1599 and 1602. Now, it may well be the case that the work of Ibn Nafis was unknown to Europe until its discovery in 1924. But it's also possible that it filtered through to the universities of Italy and then was disseminated further from there. The importance of the story lies not in who made the discovery, but in the attitude it reveals towards knowledge, because this highlights another theme. Islam places great emphasis on amana, or trust. Everything we give is given to us by God on trust. It does not belong to us. And one day we will be judged on how we dealt with it. Everything, including our bodies, brains, wealth, even the planet itself, is held by us on trust. And this also includes knowledge. Those Muslim mathematicians were always keen to note that they were developing the earlier work of the Indians. So they regarded themselves as having a role in passing on the baton of knowledge, not in owning it. They themselves were not averse to acknowledging the work of others and thereafter, where necessary, improving it. And similarly, the likes of Copernicus were not ashamed to reference the work of earlier Muslim scholars. Sadly, it just seems to be in the modern age that key periods of history are overlooked and facts are skewed to facilitate domination rather than mutual benefit. There was undoubtedly much that was wrong in the age of the Crusades, but there were also examples of cultural cross-pollination which sowed the seeds for the Renaissance itself, if that horticultural metaphor works. That European rebirth was not a one-off event when the lights were turned on and Europe emerged blinking from the dark ages. It was a process, and a significant part of that process was the influence of the Iberian Peninsula and Sicily. So the role of Muslims in that process cannot be ignored. After all, they had 8 centuries of rule in Spain, 4 in Greece, 3 in Sicily, all of which led to flourishing centres of learning and technological advancement. And it's highly unlikely that this all took place without other parts of Europe becoming aware of it, particularly given the contact and trade that was going on between them. Muslim thinkers had inherited Greek ideas after they'd invaded and conquered Egypt and the Levant. They translated and added commentaries on these ideas, which found their way into Spain and Sicily, which became important centres for this transmission of ideas. From the 11th to the 13th century, many schools dedicated to the translation of philosophical and scientific works from Arabic to Latin were established in Spain, most notably in Toledo. And it was this work of translation from Islamic cultures that constituted one of the greatest transmissions of ideas in history and paved the way for the Renaissance. The importance of this cannot be overstated. As noted by Jonathan Lyons in his book, The House of Wisdom, which he subtitled, How the Arabs Transformed Western Civilization. Quite a powerful subtitle. He refers to the Muslims as the master architects, not simply midwives, of the emerging Western worldview. There was almost an obsession in Muslim countries with devouring knowledge, developing it further, and coming up with practical benefits for society. But this approach was no coincidence, given what was contained in the holy book of the Muslims. And this brings me to the next theme I'd like to discuss, because although some may like to believe that any scientific achievements by Muslims were despite their religion, the truth is that they were almost entirely because of it. Muslims believe that the Quran is the exact word of God revealed to the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, over a period of approximately 23 years, and thereafter remaining unchanged for the next 14 centuries and counting. It's a holy book containing instructions and parables about how to live a moral life in order to serve God and thereby attain heaven in the afterlife. It contains many personalities and stories that we are familiar with from the Bible, from Adam and Eve, Noah and the flood, Moses and the Red Sea, Joseph and his brothers, the miraculous birth of Jesus, and so much more. But it also contains verses of a scientific import. Now, this does not mean it's some sort of scientific textbook. It isn't. But it contains verses which firstly touch upon scientific issues, and secondly, were simply inconsistent with the scientific knowledge available at the time. And there are some quite fascinating examples. Verses about the aquatic origin of life. Verses describing the sky as a protective ceiling. Verses describing how two seas can meet without the water mingling due to a barrier between them. Verses describing the mountains as stakes, suggesting that they had roots buried deep under the surface of the earth. Verses about the expanding universe, all knowledge unknown at the time. And verses describing the human embryo with Arabic words which denote something that clings. And it was only discovered relatively recently that the fetus does in fact cling to the womb, prompting Emeritus Professor Keith Moore, a renowned expert in embryology, to say the following about the relevant verse, which is found in the Quran in chapter 23, verse 14. And he says this: the word in the verse, alaka, refers to a leech or bloodsucker. This is an appropriate description of the human embryo from days 7 to 24, when it clings to the endometrium of the uterus, in the same way that a leech clings to the skin. Just as the leech derives blood from the host, the human embryo derives blood from the decidua, or pregnant endometrium. It's remarkable how much the embryo of 23 to 24 days resembles a leech. As there were no microscopes or lenses available in the 7th century, doctors would not have known that the human embryo had this leech-like appearance. Of course, for Muslims, there's a simple explanation. This was not the word of the desert-dwelling and arguably illiterate Muhammad, but the word of God. And its miraculous nature, therefore, comes as no surprise. Now, this isn't the time or place to discuss the merits of that belief, but rather to note that the Quran clearly addresses issues pertaining to science, and to perhaps ask ourselves why this might be. Islam is nothing if not God-centric. The word itself means submission to God. The Almighty should be the only subject of our focus and devotion. And it's for this reason that God consciousness is emphasized throughout the Quran. But the Quran also recognizes that not everyone will have this belief, and that some may need further persuasion. So we find the following verse in chapter 41, verse 53. We shall show them our signs in the universe and within themselves until it becomes clear to them that this is the truth. So, to begin with, these verses are inviting humanity to explore nature, as there are signs within it that should lead us to a belief in the Almighty. Or put another way, science itself will lead us to God. I remember when I first read Bill Bryson's A Short History of Nearly Everything, which, for somebody who isn't scientific, is a wonderful introduction, if you like, to science. And I remember contemplating his discussion of DNA and the 20 billion kilometers of it inside our bodies. Bryson highlighted that each piece of DNA contains 3.2 billion letters of coding, which means that there are an inordinate number of possible combinations that make us what we are. By one estimation, the number of such combinations is a 1 followed by 3 billion zeros. The numbers involved were mind-boggling, and it made me question what we understand to be proof and what people meant when they said there was no proof of God. As a lawyer, I was familiar with the concept of beyond reasonable doubt. I'd often be presenting to the jury that they could be satisfied beyond a reasonable doubt that the defendant was guilty because the chances of the DNA or fingerprints or whatever belonging to somebody other than the defendant were, say, 1 in a billion. Now that's a big figure, and almost invariably big enough to impress the jury, who wouldn't have any hesitation when confronted with that evidence to say, well, we're absolutely satisfied. It's a big number. 1 followed by 9 zeros. I can visualize it, as can you. I can't visualize a 1 followed by 3 billion zeros. So being the scientific person I am, I did wonder, if I wrote it down as a number, would it go from one end of this huge cathedral to the other end? And then with me being a mathematician, I calculated that it would in fact go from one end of the cathedral to Australia. That's the sort of number that you can see it written down in words, a 1 followed by 3 billion zeros, but then when you actually try and figure out what that looks like and the implications of that, if that's the number of combinations we're talking about, you see, every time our scientific inquiry leads us to finding an answer to something, it also raises more questions. There was a time when the atom was considered the smallest unit of matter, until it was split into its constituent parts, which were then considered the smallest units of matter, until they were split into their constituent parts, and so on and so forth, until we have quantum mechanics and the resulting superstring theories, which can barely be described as scientific, at least by any rational standard. So first and foremost, the Quran's scientific verses exist because the very scientific inquiry required to explore these signs of nature would themselves, that inquiry would itself lead to an appreciation of God. But there is, I would suggest, a second factor at play that Muslims in particular need to be mindful of when considering the Quran. In encouraging mankind to contemplate the wonders of nature, the Quran is giving a much wider message about the very definition of knowledge. A message that has too often been ignored and is, in my view, at least partly responsible for the decline in thinking and scientific endeavour in the Muslim world. If you ask any Muslim today, who are the people we should learn from and follow, the people who should have a degree of authority over us, the answer you will get is, it is the ulema. This word is understood to mean religious scholars. So today, the ulema are those who are in a position to give a religious ruling or opinion, generally on what is or isn't permissible in Islam. Fine. Now, Arabic is an amazing language about which I need to learn a lot more. And part of its beauty is in the interconnectedness of words, how there are so many derivations from a single root. So, by way of example, adrus means I study. A dars is a lesson. A madrasa is a school, etc., etc. You get the picture. And of course it makes it easier to learn in some respects because you can often figure out what is being spoken of once you get the root. Anyway, let's get back to the word ulema, religious scholars. It's the plural of the word alim. It's derived from the word ilm, which means knowledge. It occurs in chapter 35 of the Quran, where in verses 27 to 28, mankind is exhorted to understand nature, and therefore God, by considering the following: how rain falls from the sky, the different fruits that grow as a result, the different types of mountains and their colours, the varieties of humans as well as animals. And that section concludes with these words: only those of God's servants fear him who are knowledgeable. Only those of God's servants fear him who are knowledgeable. In other words, you do the work, the investigation, the exploration, and the ensuing knowledge will leave you in awe of the Almighty. And the word used in verse 28 to mean those who are knowledgeable is ulema. It's perhaps also worth pausing here to note that there's no promotion of blind faith, no suggestion that you should simply believe because I told you to, but rather do the work and find out for yourselves. So for Muslims, this should beg the question, when God is using the word ulema in the Quran, Is he referring to a select group of individuals purporting to have some expertise in religion? Because it looks like he's talking about those who are going to carry out those specific inquiries. How rain falls from the sky, the different fruits that grow as a result, mountains, humans, animals, meteorologists, botanists, geologists, anthropologists, biologists. In other words, scientists. So if we go back to the root of the word ulema being ilm, which means knowledge, then it seems reasonable to conclude that it is not confined to religious knowledge. And it's worth recalling that in Islam's golden age, if you like, those centuries of discovery and innovation, the knowledgeable were polymaths who didn't restrict themselves to one discipline. They were masters of mathematics, medicine, astronomy, and they knew their religion. Remember the poet Omar Khayyam and his calculation of the length of the solar year. And these polymaths did not just sit in their ivory towers, writing books and remaining aloof from the world. Their knowledge was put to practical use, whether for the benefit of the individual's medical needs or for the betterment and beautification of society as a whole. One just has to look at the marvels such as the Alhambra and its gardens, or the Grand Mosque of Cordoba, to see the uses this knowledge was put to. And so we find stunning success stories like the city of Cordoba, which 1,000 years ago was described as the ornament of the world, because it was one of the largest cities in the world, boasting clean running water and street lighting at a time when much of the rest of Europe was dank, dark, and dirty. But of course, nothing lasts forever. Often periods of success are followed by decline, and this was true as much of Muslim societies as others. But another problem they had to contend with was the way their religion increasingly came to be interpreted. Those very verses which encouraged inquiry were now being ignored in favour of blind imitation. Now, to some extent, this was inevitable. If, after all, your scholars have been responsible for some of the greatest discoveries, then you'd be foolish for not relying on them. So a process began where increasingly the answers to problems were found by looking back. For the practical reason that you had resources you could rely upon, but dangerously aided and abetted by a veneer of religious justification. I mean, who was more worthy of being followed? Those of the past, from the Prophet himself to the amazing scholars who had produced such scientific works, or those flawed individuals who make up the present? Ehsan Massoud, in his book Science and Islam, sums up the consequences of this approach as follows. The unrequited longing for a golden age diminishes the potential for discovery, invention, and innovation today. It's difficult to move forward when all you're doing is looking in the rear view mirror. And the results are there for all to see. The very religion that for centuries was a byword for dynamism and innovation now began to stagnate. Knowledge came to be increasingly defined as and restricted to religious knowledge. The respect previously accorded to scientific scholars was now becoming the preserve of a clergy in all but name. It remains a feature of Islam that there is no clergy. I am just as eligible to lead a prayer in a mosque as the next man, as long as I have the relevant knowledge. But we've ended up creating a clergy by default. And of course, other nations built themselves up, used science to their advantage, had their industrial revolutions, and then took over the mantle of leadership in the world. It's not a coincidence that scientific achievement flourishes in societies that are militarily strong, financially prosperous, politically stable, and educationally advanced. Sadly, today much of the Muslim world is characterized by traits which are the complete opposite and are lacking even the most elementary education standards. The reasons behind this would require another lecture of its own, but suffice it to say that the buck stops with Muslims themselves, regardless of the role that others might play. Today, a few Muslim countries can claim some prosperity, but that alone is clearly insufficient if they hope to recreate the innovative environment for which they were once known. And they must start with the basics. Denying their populations the freedom to think and express themselves has the inevitable result of stifling development and contrasts starkly with Muslim societies of 1,000 years ago. As for the question of outside interference, although criticism should rightly be directed at those who colonize and interfere, questions should also be asked of those who allow themselves to become colonizable. Taking responsibility is inherent in Islam, and that applies as much to societies as individuals. Blaming others for taking advantage of your weakness gets you nowhere and is inconsistent with the trust that has been placed upon us. We've all been given brains, and some of us have been blessed with time, money, and other assets, and one day we will be questioned about the use to which we put it all, the extent to which we sought knowledge, and what we did with it, having acquired it. The Islamic view of knowledge, be it scientific or otherwise, is that it is not owned exclusively. They're to be patented, trademarked, and used as a tool to subjugate others. It's to be sought wherever it can be found, and thereafter used for the benefit of humanity. And those historical Muslim achievements illustrate this in practice. So as this unscientific meander draws to a close, it's perhaps worth reflecting on some of those themes. The Dark Ages were not dark everywhere, because there were centuries of staggering thought and scientific progress in the Muslim world. This progress was a direct result of the exhortations of Islamic scripture, particularly the Quran, and its emphasis on thinking and seeking knowledge. This resulting knowledge was used to benefit individuals and societies and was not guarded jealously. On the contrary, it was disseminated widely. and it was this dissemination that sowed the seeds of the Renaissance. But just as the baton was passed to Muslims, so it passed from Muslims. Decline set in, and when it does, as we find today, funding dries up for projects deemed to be optional extras. Scientific discovery was sadly placed into that category, and the rot set in, leading to today's situation where Muslim countries find themselves lagging behind. But just as in the past the West learned from Muslims, today Muslims can learn from the West. Keeping their faith while embracing technological advancement is not new for Muslims. Its spirit just needs to be rediscovered, so that Muslims can once again play a full role in fulfilling the trust given to humanity and work for the betterment of the planet and its inhabitants. That is service to the Almighty. Thank you.